Χριστοδουλάκη, μια άνω τελεία. Κύριε Χριστοδουλάκη, αν θέλετε μία άνω τελεία θα συνεχίσουμε τη συζήτησή σας. Θα συνεχίσουμε. Βλέπετε πίσω σας. Είναι μαζί μας.
Θα καμία ιδέα που θα πει.
Γι' αυτό το κάνουμε ακριβώς.
Είναι λοιπόν μαζί μας η κυρία Lucie Castets, ζωντανά μέσω Zoom από την Γαλλία, υποψήφια Πρωθυπουργός του Νέου Λαϊκού Μετώπου στη χώρα. Bonsoir, Madame Castets. Merci d'être avec nous.
Bonsoir à tous. Merci à vous. Good evening. I'm very happy to be with you and also honored. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here with us. So, how do you assess the rise of the extreme right in Europe and especially in France? And what can be done to comfort it?
Thanks for this very important question. I think that the rise of the extreme right in France and more globally in Europe has three main reasons. The first one would be a rise in racist ideas. I think it's not deniable that in average people express more racist opinions recently than during the past decades. Well, it is true that the locations where migrants represent a truly significant part of the population, like in cosmopolitan cities like London, Paris, or Milan, are where the far-right scores are the lowest in elections, and on the contrary, it is where migrants are barely seen, for example, the countryside and the provincial towns in France, and also most of Eastern Europe. This is where the far-right is very high. But when you ask people why they vote for the extreme right, this is what I did during the legislative elections in France. I went to see door to door, knock on doors and say, who do you vote for? People say they vote for far right because there are too many foreigners in France. And when you ask them if there are consequences on their daily life, some of them, many of them say, well, I don't really know, but I saw that on TV, that there is a very bad impact in France. So I think also here the media play a very strong role in developing these racist ideas and helping them spread in the society. The second reason, I think it's economic policy and its consequences. Even if unemployment is quite low in France right now, there is a strong inflation. And in particular, there are higher energy costs because of the war in Ukraine. And this has a very important impact on purchasing power for people. And also, it is true to say that there is little austerity. There was little austerity in the last few years on a global scale in European countries because they had to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and also the war in Ukraine. But it is true that the money has been spent, but it's difficult for people to exactly identify where these expenses were made and what were the consequences, the positive consequences on their daily life, and in particular in public services. In France, the public services have been starving. I mean, they need more investment, more money, and people see that in their daily life. And in that context, I think migrants are seen as competing with locals for access to more scarce public services. And also the narrative of migrants stealing jobs is to be heard in many, many places in France. And the last reason, would be a democratic crisis. I believe that there is a very strong resentment in France, a strong bitterness against politicians. And I think it is because the governments over the years have shown that they don't really care or listen to what people are expecting, even if they say differently. Because, for example, in France, we had a strong democratic crisis in 2019, which was called the Gilets jaunes crisis. Many people went to on roundabout on the road and wore yellow jackets, and they were expressing their bitterness and their disagreement with the policy. And the president launched a great debate and offered people the opportunity to fill in registers of grievances for example, in small villages, small cities, to express their feelings, their expectations. And actually 2 million people went to city halls and wrote down their views to express their feelings and what they were expecting from politicians. And what happened after that? Nothing. So I think this creates some fuel for extreme right parties. So what can be done? I think we need to address these three issues. First, fight against the propagation of racist ideas everywhere, anytime, including by better regulation of the media industry. Second, we need to finance public services and offer better economic opportunities to people. And finally, we need to change the way institutions are working with a better decision-making process and also better consultation mechanisms so people can feel on board.
Although the new Popular Front won the most seats in the elections, you are not the Prime Minister. How do you explain that, and what are the steps ahead for you and your party?
I think two elements in parallel are now threatening the very foundation of our institutional system in France. First, the dramatic rise of the extreme right. And second, the president's refusal to accept the choice he asked the French electorate to make with these recent elections. So the Nouveau Front Populaire, the New Popular Front, the NFP, worked during the whole summer with the rest of the parties during the elections to beat the extreme right. The NFP came ahead in the vote, and yet President Macron refused to follow through. And I think we are now in an institutional crisis of epic proportions. The NFP has shown that it is very well aware of the need for dialogue across the aisle and of consensus building beyond political parties. But now Macron, despite the NFP outreach to all political forces except the far right, has been essentially saying voters that their vote didn't matter, which is very worrying for me now because we had record-breaking participation in this election, which is really not often the case, and yet the result of the election is not being followed. So what to do now? What to do next? I think in the short term, the progressive bloc, so the parties from the left, should work very hard to fight on every text at the parliament. As you may know, we are now discussing our budget for 2025. So parties are fighting to preserve public services and social expenditures against the government project, which is proposing a very strong austerity cure. In the middle term, I think the French left has to stand united, which is very difficult, and it has to deliver. To stay united, to show its resolve to deliver for everyday citizens, together with those who also believe that time for change has come, and that this change cannot be the dangerous illusion of the extreme right. This implies working all together, not fighting, together with all progressive political parties, but also with the representatives of unions, trade unions, associations, activists, and also basic citizens. I think the left has to build altogether a narrative, a new narrative to explain what our country would look like after 5 or maybe 10 years with left-wing parties governing it.
Madame Castets, allow me to ask you one last question. You're an economist with a strong experience in government and international organizations. What do you believe that should be the priorities for progressive economic governments in Europe today?
I think our main priority should be to fight a very strong cultural battle. There are many topics where the left is not able to be heard, and I think we would be more credible across Europe if we are able to push for common goals and develop common argumentation on these topics. I would take two topics. The first one is economic issues. We have to be more determined in demonstrating that we are right. I think we have to demonstrate that austerity has very negative consequences, in particular in these times where the growth is low, very negative consequences not only on people's life, but also on the economy. For example, in France right now, the budget that is being discussed at the parliament if it is implemented as proposed by the government, it will have very strong bad impacts on regional and local authorities that will not be able to invest as much as before, and then it will have a very bad negative impact on the global economy. So we have to fight to make sure that people understand that our economic policy is the most credible and also the most serious. Second topic, I think we should also talk about migration. Europe is now faced with demographic decline, and even right-wing governments are listening more to industry's demand for more migrants. For example, we know that Giorgia Meloni in Italy, she's right-wing, but she recently increased the number of work visas for foreign workers. So we have to fight to explain that on migration, the left bloc has a more credible and more human policy, and the proposals are more credible. And also, I think to win this cultural battle, I think that we should, as often as possible, base our proposals on a global narrative based on concrete example of policies that have been developed in other countries in Europe with progressive government. Even if there can be political differences between the governments and the parties, we should base our policy and proposals on concrete example. For example, I was personally excited to see Labour coming back to power in the UK after 15 years of dereliction of public services in the name of the economic orthodoxy. And also, I think Spain will offer us a new example of progressive policies, in particular in the economic field. So I think it's very important for us to work as a bloc and give ourselves examples.
Thank you. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank
Bon
you.
courage et bonne chance.
Merci.